Ok, buenas tardes. Bienvenidos a la clase magistral de hoy. Antes de presentar a nuestro invitado de hoy, quería informarles que quienes quieren escuchar la clase magistral en español, pueden ir al icono de mundo en la parte de abajo y escoger el canal español. Ahí van a escuchar la conferencia en español. Y los que no pueden quedarse en la sala principal y ahí escucharemos a nuestro conferencista. La clase magistral de hoy es parte del curso Determinantes Sociales de la Salud, que es un curso del primer semestre de la Maestría de Salud Pública y Salud Global que organiza la Facultad de Salud Pública de la Universidad Peruana Cayetano Heredia, que este año cumple 25 años y esta es una manera de celebrarlo porque tenemos a un invitado de primer nivel, el profesor Sir Michael Marmot, es epidemiólogo y doctor en epidemiología por la Universidad de Berkeley. Él es director del Instituto de Equidad en Salud de UCL, de la University College London, y es un reconocido experto mundial en el tema de salud pública y determinantes sociales de la salud. Hace poco escuché en una presentación que tuvo él en su alma mater en Berkeley, California, que el profesor Marmot es el salubrista, el investigador y experto en salud pública más citado en Google Scholar, un poco después de Freud. Es un honor y un placer para la Facultad de Salud Pública de Cayetano Heredia tener con nosotros al profesor Sir Michael Marmot, que es muy reconocido en este campo. Professor Marmot, thank you for being with us today. It's an honor and pleasure to have you here again, to see you again after some time. And the floor is yours. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Well, thank you. And with the miracles of modern communications, this comes to you from rural Italy, where I'm sitting in a little house in the olive groves, looking at the olive trees with the Mediterranean in the distance. But I hope that won't change what we talk about.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, good. You can see the slides.
Yes.
And it moved. So I'm going to talk about social determinants, a little bit about ethnicity and health equity. At the opening line of my book, The Health Gap, was why treat people and send them back to the conditions that made them sick. Particularly at the time of the pandemic, people thought a great deal about the health care system, and rightly so. And the Health Organization thinks a great deal about universal health coverage, and rightly so. But my concern is with the conditions that make people sick. When we launched the WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health, J.W. Lee, then the Director General of WHO, said that the Commission would report in 2008, which was 60 years after the founding of WHO, with its ringing declaration of health not just being the absence of disease, and of course the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. 30 years after Alma Ata and Declaration of Health for All by the year 2000, and that the way to achieve it was through primary healthcare. And he said, we're looking for a similar inspirational vision from the report of the Commission on Social Determinants of Health. At the same time, in 2008, WHO produced its report on primary healthcare. And these are our commissioners. Sadly, J.W. Lee had died, and Margaret Chan was the Director General. There she is. And I as chair, and our commissioners, President Lagos of Chile. And we said, when we launched the commission report, we wanted to create a social movement for health equity through action on the social determinants of health. I was not entirely clear what a social movement is or how you create one. But I think there's some evidence that we've been successful and that our social movement is happening. The very fact that I am giving you this lecture today from Italy to Peru is part of that social movement. We said on the cover of the WHO Commission report, social injustice is killing people on a grand scale. Somewhat unusual for a WHO report. We called the report Closing the Gap in a Generation, Health Equity Through Action on the Social Determinants of Health. I've already said what we said about social injustice. And we put empowerment at the heart of what was needed. And I think of empowerment as having three dimensions. Material. If you can't feed your children, you can't be empowered. Psychosocial, having agency, having control over your life. And political, having voice. And we said we wanted to create the conditions for people to lead flourishing lives. We published that report in 2008. And we made a virtue of necessity. We said that it was vitally important that countries take our recommendations and translate it into practical recommendations for that country, because how could we make global recommendations that were appropriate for 194 countries? They needed to be tailored. In Britain, the British government invited me to prepare a report to answer the question, how could we apply the findings and recommendations of the global WHO report to one country, England? And in 2010, I published the Marmot Review, Fair Society, Healthy Lives. In February 2020, just before the pandemic crashed upon us, we published Health Equity in England, the Marmot Review, 10 years on. And we looked at what had happened over the previous 10 years. And I'm not going to go into detail in that now in this lecture. Some other time I can tell you about it. But we had in the Marmot Review and repeated in the 10-year-on report, 6 domains of recommendations. Give every child the best start in life, education and lifelong learning, employment and working conditions. Number 4, everyone should have at least the minimum standard, minimum income necessary for a healthy life. Number 5, healthy and sustainable places and communities, and strengthening the role and impact of ill health prevention, taking a social determinants approach to lifestyle. And I would argue that these 6, although we adapted them from the Global Commission report for England, would apply much more generally. In the light of COVID, and I'll come back to that, we've added a 7th, tackle racism, discrimination, and their outcomes. And the eighth one, in a way, was there from the beginning: pursue environmental sustainability and health equity together. Put these two crucial agendas together. And then I was invited by the European region of WHO to conduct a commission. We reported on social determinants and the health divide in the European region. I told you I have some evidence that the social movement is happening. And then the Pan American Health Organization, the American branch of WHO, invited me to chair the Commission of PAHO on Equity and Health Inequalities in the Americas. And for those of you who've seen the WHO Commission report, you'll be familiar with this conceptual framework, which we adapted for the PAHO report. We have structural drivers: political, social, cultural, and economic structures, the natural environment, land, climate change, history and legacy of ongoing colonialism and structural racism. And we had chapters and recommendations corresponding to each of these topics. And then 7 topics in conditions of daily life: early life and education, working life, older people, income and social protection. So you see, we've got the political, social, cultural, macroeconomic in structural drivers, and income and social protection in conditions of daily life. Violence, we've got natural environment, land and climate change in structural driver, but environment and housing as conditions of daily life, and health systems. And then 2 chapters on taking action, governance and human rights. And we took the approach of intersectionality, social and economic inequities, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, disability, and migration. And the outcome is health equity and dignified life. So we had 12 recommendations corresponding to each of these in order to achieve health equity and dignified life. We reported on an American version of the Preston curve. This comes from our World in Data. If you plot GDP per capita adjusting for purchasing power on the x-axis and life expectancy on the y-axis, you see that at low levels of national income, there's quite a steep relation between GDP and life expectancy. If Haiti got as rich as Bolivia, it's likely that life expectancy would improve. If Bolivia got as rich as Brazil, it's likely, or Mexico, it's likely that their life expectancy would improve. But when you get up to this level, Cuba, Costa Rica, Chile, and go all the way out to the United States at $60,000 per person, there's no relation between national and life expectancy. So at low levels of national income, there's a steep relation. For a poor country, one way to improve health is to get richer. But when you get up to this level of about $15,000, $17,000 per person at international dollars, Costa Rica, Chile is a bit higher, their life expectancy is longer than in the United States. Canada is poorer than the US and longer life expectancy. Once you get above that threshold, the way to get healthier is not to get richer. It's action on the social determinants of health. And look at this. inequalities in mortality in the US and Costa Rica by rank of socioeconomic status. The inequalities are much steeper in the US than they are in Costa Rica. In both countries, there's a gradient. The lower the socioeconomic position, the higher the mortality. But the gradient is steeper in the US. The inequalities are bigger. And if we compare the US with England, this comes from the Financial Times. Each dot represents a geographical area, fine-grained geographical area, and life expectancy. And along the income distribution, you can see that at every level of income, England has longer life expectancy than the US. And the US disadvantage gets bigger lower down. Now, the US is richer, so this is the distribution of income within the country. If you look at the fact that the US is richer than England, for a given level of income, the gap is enormous. So the US is doing very badly. A handful of the US super rich managed to match English life expectancies. As I said, getting rich for a country is not the way to get healthier. The United States is very rich, but not very healthy. And we see gradients everywhere. You notice what I'm showing you is a gradient. It's not just that poor people have shorter life expectancy than rich people. It's finely graded all the way from top to bottom. People in the middle have shorter life expectancy than those at the top. And look at the US, all the way from top to bottom. It's not just about poverty, important as that is. Here's Brazil. Cardiovascular deaths in Porto Alegre in southern Brazil classify people by where they live, the socioeconomic level of the district, high, medium, low, low, and cardiovascular deaths, a very clear social gradient. The poorer the area, the higher the mortality. So-called attributable CVD deaths are attributable to having a socioeconomic level below the very top. And 45% of all cardiovascular deaths are attributable to having a socioeconomic level below the top. Inequalities are not a footnote to the real problems in health. They are the real problems in health. Peru, Lima, the lowest socioeconomic level and the highest socioeconomic level, and then metropolitan and rural districts. Look at the huge gap at age 60 to 69, 50 to 59, 40 to 49. Huge differences, and differences between metropolitan and rural areas. In the PAHO report, we talked about structural drivers, natural environment, climate change, and relationship to land. Look at this from Central America back in 2016. In Costa Rica, something like 98% of energy was renewable. In Panama, it was 2/3. In Central America, back in 2016, they'd made huge strides in shifting from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And it's important, not just for climate change, but for air pollution. Wow. Air pollution in the Americas. This is estimate of average 2.5 concentration. in selected countries of the Americas. And there's Peru, PM 2.5 concentrations, high levels of air pollution. There's Canada, way down there. So things are not going so well in controlling air pollution. And of course, the two go together. Reduced burning of fossil fuels is good for sustainability. It's also good for reducing PM 2.5 concentrations. Conditions of daily life, equity from the start. Poverty by ethnicity in Peru, white or mestizo, Negro, mulatto, Zambo, and indigenous populations. There we see it. Ethnicity is strongly related to poverty levels. In the US, there's been a long-standing debate. Do you reduce the black-white differences by dealing with economic inequalities or by dealing with racism? And the answer is, you do both. You reduce economic inequalities and you deal with racism. If we look at the OECD countries at child poverty, I've got Mexico here because it's an OECD country, and the United States. Child poverty is defined as less than 60% median income. There's Iceland, Czech Republic, Denmark, Finland, Korea, Slovenia, Poland, 10, 11, 12% poverty. There's the UK, getting up to 25% by this measure. And out of 41 countries in the UK, we rank 31. The United States ranks 38th, actually higher levels of child poverty than Mexico. It's not because the US is a poor country. It's because the US tolerates high levels of child poverty. They have very low tax rates. They don't use the fiscal system to reduce child poverty. And spending on early childhood. For the rich countries, the OECD countries, the average spend per child per year is $6,000. In Norway and Sweden, they spend around $12,000. In France, about $9,000. The average is $6,000. In the UK, we spend $4,000. Wow. Not as bad as the US. That spends $3,000. There's Chile and Mexico. A long way to go. So part of going from being a middle-income country to a higher-income country, dealing with the social determinants of health, is reducing child poverty and increasing expenditure on preschool. And it makes a difference. Under 5 mortality rates by coverage of social safety net programs in the poorest quintile. So coverage of social safety net programs in the poorest quintile, Chile, Uruguay, Peru's quite good, and relatively low levels of under 5 mortality. The Dominican Republic, Honduras, less good coverage and higher under 5 mortality. Percent of the population without access to improved water sources. And not surprisingly, the under 5 mortality is higher. This is pretty basic. Clean water, lower under 5 mortality rates. And part of early childhood, of course, is growth. Height development, comparison between poor and non-poor children under 5. During the first 24 months of life, the widest inequities between poor and non-poor in height. So there's the non-poor and there's the poorest quintile. Huge differences. And you can see at birth, it's small, but it opens up. Nutrition. But we know you can make a difference. Cash transfer programs, conditional cash transfer programs, originated in the Americas, Brazil and Mexico particularly. There was a recent review, 2023, in Nature, looking at the effect of cash transfer programs on mortality in women, men, and children under 5, the year of the cash transfer period. And you can see after the cash transfer period, there was an enduring effect on mortality in children under 5, in men, and particularly in women. Giving poor people cash is quite a good way to improve their health and the health of their young children. And social policy can make a difference to income inequality. We produced this in our PAHO report. The data come from ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. This is the change to the Gini coefficient of income inequality from direct transfers and indirect transfers. So in Argentina, where there is, relatively speaking, a comprehensive social protection system, the Gini coefficient is reduced by direct transfers and in-kind transfers. In Mexico, where there's an intermediate level of social protection system, the Gini coefficient of income inequality is reduced a bit, but not as much as in Argentina. And in El Salvador, with a limited social protection system, not very much. Government expenditure can be quite important. Reducing child poverty, spending on early childhood, social protection to reduce income inequality. Pre-primary attendance by lowest and highest income quintile. The lowest income quintile and the highest income quintile. So poorer children aren't going to preschool nearly as much as richer children. In all these countries, Jamaica has the smallest gap. And we know that attendance at preschool is a strong predictor of how well children do in school, which in turn predicts what happens to them when they leave school in terms of employment, income, housing, and health. And completion rates for upper secondary education by Indigenous and non-Indigenous population. So here's the non-Indigenous, non-Afro-descendant population, and completion of upper secondary education over time. And you can see Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, less so in Peru, interestingly, Uruguay, and the average for these countries, that in general, Peru looks the best, but in general, non-Indigenous populations have higher completion rates for upper secondary education than Indigenous populations. Social mobility, I was talking to a European group, and I've got Brazil here. I was talking to a European group, and I said, one of the challenges is equity between the generations. Not just, we commonly think of equity within the generation, like the graphs I've shown you, poor versus rich, intermediate versus rich or versus poor. But what about equity between the generations? If you're in Denmark and you're born into a family of low income, at the current rate of social mobility, it would take 2 generations to go from low income to middle income. In Finland, Norway, or Sweden, it would take 3 generations. The average for the rich countries, OECD, it would take 4.5 generations. For the UK and the United States, it would take 5. And in Brazil, it would take 9 generations. Why such a difference? And I can tell you, Peru looks like Brazil. Why such a difference? By and large, we can talk about poverty, inequality, and investment in early childhood. Those 3 make a huge difference. The higher the poverty level, the less chance of being upwardly mobile. The greater the Gini coefficient of inequality, the greater the distance between the rungs of the ladder, the greater the difficulty to get from one rung to the next. And I've shown you the investment in preschool that makes a difference. And I was addressing 53 European countries. And I said, for many of us, we're starting to look more like Brazil than we are like Denmark because of we're not doing anything about child poverty, because of increasing inequalities and the lack of investment in early childhood. If you want your children to have a chance to move up, you have to invest in reducing poverty, in reducing inequality, and in preschool. And then, of course, there's violence. Homicide rates in Latin America are really very high. Venezuela, Honduras, Peru doesn't look quite as bad. Peru's down here, which is because it's not, there are no data in this particular comparison. But Latin America has very high homicide rates. Violence is an issue, as of course is violence against women. Rates of femicide in Latin America. And these are very inaccurate because of reporting problems. But Honduras, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Bolivia, Brazil, and this is femicide, Peru. That doesn't get at the whole issue of violence against women. We know globally, 1/3 of women at some point in their lives will suffer violence at the hands of a domestic partner. Huge issue, not confined to Latin America, but it is an issue in Latin America. And then, of course, came the pandemic. I mentioned that in England, I produced Health Equity in England, the Marmot Review 10 years on. In February 2020, just before the pandemic crashed upon us, and then came the pandemic. And we said from the beginning that the pandemic would expose the underlying inequalities in society and amplify them. And so it proved. These are data from England, and we had very good data going into the pandemic and all the way through. This is the social gradient in all-cause mortality. So classify people by where they live, classify where they live by level of deprivation, and the greater the deprivation, the higher the mortality from all causes. And there's the COVID-19 mortality. Wow. It's almost exactly parallel to the all-cause mortality. The gradient's slightly steeper. Remember, we said the pandemic would expose the underlying inequalities in society and amplify them. And so it proved. We think the gradient's slightly steeper because people in the most deprived 3 deciles were likely to have occupational exposure and live in overcrowded households. But in general, there's a gradient. And that means vaccination is important, social distancing is important, specific antiviral measures. But so is action on the social determinants of health. And you can see that not all countries did equally well. These are the rich countries. A report from American colleagues looked at the US compared with what they called 19 peer countries. Life expectancy went down 2020 compared with 2019, went down again in 2021. So this is life expectancy. It's not just COVID mortality, it's excess deaths. The other countries that did worse were Scotland, Northern Ireland, Germany, and England and Wales. We did very poorly during the pandemic. In fact, when you look at health improvement in the decade from 2010 to 2020, the countries that had the slowest improvement in life expectancy in that decade among the rich countries were the United Kingdom and the United States. In general, the countries that were doing worse from the point of view of their health before the pandemic did worse during the pandemic. Why? My speculation is that it could work at 4 levels. Poor governance and political culture. Number 2, increasing social and economic inequalities. Number 3, disinvestment from public services. And number 4, being unhealthy. Being unhealthy means you're at higher risk when COVID comes along. And as you know well, Peru did poorly. Complete and partial COVID vaccination by country. Chile, Cuba, Uruguay did pretty well. Peru, not bad, but complete was only 64%. So not bad, but not brilliantly well. So part of the problem, of course, was access to effective prevention and treatment. But the other things that I mentioned, poor governance, inequalities, public services, and level of illness were all very important. And it's because of all of this that UNAIDS asked me to co-chair a new global council on inequality, AIDS, and pandemics. We announced it in Brasilia. The Minister of Health in Brazil will be a member of the council. Winnie Byanyima, the Executive Director of UNAIDS, and I were in the Ministry of Health in Brazil, announcing this new global council on inequality, AIDS, and pandemics. Precisely because we say that inequality is driving pandemics, and the pandemic increases inequalities. Look at this. Life expectancy at birth. I showed you that the US did poorly during the pandemic. So life expectancy at birth for non-Hispanic whites fell by 3 years. And from 2019 to 2020. It fell by 5 years among Black Americans. And among Hispanic, and fell by 6 years among Black Americans. So everyone was affected, but Hispanics and Blacks were affected to greater extent. And in general, countries with higher rates of income inequality have higher rates of death of COVID-19, of AIDS, and of HIV infection. In Brazil, white people have seen falling rates of HIV. Black people face rising rates in recent years. All this is very challenging. I've given you a lot of bad news and a lot of challenges. I haven't gone into the picture in my own country, in the UK, but it looks pretty bleak. What happened over that decade from 2010 to 2019 was that life expectancy more or less stopped improving. Inequalities in health got bigger, and life expectancy for the poorest people got worse. To remind you, these are the recommendations that I made. Childhood poverty went up. Spending on education went down. The rise of the gig economy said increase in child poverty. Disinvestment from local government. All look pretty bad. And then these issues. That's all depressing. But I'm not depressed. Why not? We've been working with cities and local authorities. In the UK, more than 40 local authorities have declared themselves marmot places. Gwent was the first one in Wales. We're now talking to Fife in Scotland. When I got back from Brazil, we launched Leeds as a marmot city. So the first was Coventry, a marmot city, then Greater Manchester. We did a report, Build Back Fairer in Greater Manchester, Altogether Fairer in Cheshire and Merseyside. You know these places because they've got famous football teams. Manchester City and Manchester United. Liverpool is in Cheshire and Merseyside. Lancashire and Cumbria, Luton, Waltham Forest, and we've got these coming up. We've got these cities that say, okay, if the national government won't act, we'll act. Our funding's been cut. It's difficult. But it's not just the healthcare system in these places. It's local government. It's the voluntary and community sector. Business, the police, education. And I finish by saying, quoting Nelson Mandela, overcoming poverty is not a gesture of charity. It's an act of justice. It's the protection of fundamental human rights, the right to dignity and a decent life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Marmot. Sorry for the delay. It has been a great lecture, as usual, and we would like to have a moment with you to have questions from the audience.
Yep.
Do you think that every country should define, should start and analyze and define the solid facts for each country? What is your opinion that you have done this in UK, and you have a movement about that?
Yeah, very much so. I don't think each country should start from the beginning and to review all the evidence and start from the beginning. We've got good evidence. We've done these commissions in three: the Global Commission, Europe, the American Commission, and also, I didn't mention, we've done one for North Africa and the Middle East. So we've reviewed the evidence. We've got the advantage, the example of marmot cities in the UK. So I would say what's needed is, and it can be at national level, but it could be at regional or at city level. What's needed is to take the evidence, get a committed group of people, including representatives of the communities that are being served, and work out how to make the evidence relevant for that country, region, city. So yes, I think every country does need to do this. They, as I say, they don't need to start from the beginning again to review the evidence. We've done that. The task is to take the evidence and the recommendations that we've made and work out how to apply them in their own context. So yes, I do think every country should be doing it.
Could you share with us how does the Marmot City project has addressed nutritious food access for all? I mean, in your movement,
well,
how do you have reached this?
So what's interesting with the Marmot cities is different cities have their own priorities. So the most recent one was Leeds, the English city of Leeds. I mentioned I came back from Brazil and then went to Leeds to launch it. And they said to us, our priorities are children and young people and housing. So that's where we want to put our efforts. Okay, good. We'll work with you to what that should look like to improve health equity by action on children and young people and housing. Others might say, no, we want to put our effort into making sure everyone has a healthy diet, good nutrition. I mean, we know in Britain, as in many other countries, that childhood obesity is much more a problem for poorer children than for richer children. Shows a social gradient. The greater the deprivation, the greater the frequency of childhood obesity. And why? Well, because food insecurity is greater in poorer households. And when you're food insecure, you get whatever food you can. And if that's ultra-processed food, if that's junk food in a country like the UK, that tends to be cheaper than nutritious food. And what we know, I mean, in Mexico, for example, where I was recently, they have the problem of undernutrition and overnutrition in the same families, in the same household. They'll have children who are stunted and they'll have children who are obese. And they seem to have gone from traditional diet to ultra-processed diet without anything in between. So yes, healthy nutrition should be part of it, but some cities put more effort on that and others put more effort on other things.
You have shared the Equity and Inequalities in Health Commission for Latin America. One person asked about what are the main challenges in Latin America to measure inequalities? What would be your advice for that? You have
so Latin America, I mean, every region, not quite, but the Americas is not the only region that claims to have the most inequality. Is pretty big in the Afro region too, but inequality, the region of the Americas is certainly marked by huge inequalities. And those inequalities are income and wealth, but it's more than that. It's inequalities in the conditions to lead lives of dignity, to lead lives that people have reason to value, which we put at the heart of what we were trying to achieve. Now, I would argue, well, I would, wouldn't I? The way to take action is to look at the 12 domains of recommendations we made in our PAHO Commission report. That means action on the structural drivers, the macroeconomic, the environmental, on racism and discrimination, and ongoing colonialism. And Latin America is in a very interesting stage right now. This frightening man in Argentina, they just got rid of a frightening man in Brazil, and Lula's come back. Chile is in an interesting stage. I mean, Latin America, you know, the big challenges have always been political. I won't comment on Peru, not because it's unimportant, but because you know a lot more about Peru's politics than I do. But so the challenges, of course, are political. But it's taking action on our 12 domains of recommendations. And it means that there's got to be a commitment to fairness, to social justice. An important part of that is health equity. And what I would say is where it's difficult to get action at the national level, and this is what we found in the UK, we get action at city and local level. And that's quite possible in the Latin American context, to think of action at the city level as well as at the national level. In Europe, Italy got really interested. They've got a very right-wing neo-fascist government nationally, but we've got part of Rome, Palermo, Torino, Trieste, Bologna. We've got cities in Italy that are really interested in sustainable health equity, taking action on the social determinants of health. So I'd say we've made the recommendations, act at national level, but if that isn't possible, or in addition, act at city and regional level as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. For the audience, you can go to PAHO's website and look for this for the report that Professor Marmot prepared with a group of people, where you can have more details about these recommendations. And there is another question about the relationship between health promotion and the social determinants of health, given that taking action through the Healthy Cities strategy requires implementing policies, intersectoral cooperation, and working with the community. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, the health promotion, did you say?
Yes, health promotion.
Yeah. I mean, conceptually, health promotion is quite similar to social determinants of health. In practice, it tends to be more focused on health behaviors. Say conceptually, it's quite similar, but in practice, people doing health promotion tend to be more focused on health behaviors. As you can see from the recommendations, take my English review, we talk about child poverty, giving every child the best start in life. Now, that's not usually what health promotion specialists focus on. It means we've got to be working with the Ministry of Finance, with the Ministry of Education, or if it's not national, as we've been doing in these marmot cities, working with local education authorities, working with local, for example, there's something in the UK called the Citizens Advice Bureau that it can't set fiscal policy, it can't determine the levels of child poverty, but what it can do is give advice to people how to access benefits, how to deal with the fact of their poverty, and to try to make a difference. And key to all of this is engagement with communities. Absolutely key for a whole variety of reasons, philosophical, practical, emotional, political, but absolutely key is engaging with communities, not coming in and saying, we know what you need, we're going to give you what you need. Rather, we've got to work together. I had an Indigenous Australian woman say, if you're coming in to solve our problems, then we have no interest in you. If you're coming to work with us, then you're welcome.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's crucial.
Thank you. What do you think about using vouchers to get health care? Do you think that a strategy could help to reduce inequalities? The use of vouchers to get access to health care?
No, is the simple answer. No.
Why?
Because I think all countries should be moving to a system of healthcare free at the point of use. There shouldn't be economic barriers. So what happens if you've used up your vouchers? Does that mean you can't get any healthcare? If you've got diabetes and cardiovascular disease and renal problems, and then you get COVID, and you've got no more vouchers left, so you don't get healthcare? No, we should be moving to having healthcare available, high quality healthcare available to all, free at the point of use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A very simple, a very clear answer to that question.
Well, for what it's worth, our National Health Service in Britain was the visionary who started it, Nye Bevan, and I was asked to give the Bevan lecture a few weeks ago in London. And so I thought a lot about Nye Bevan and the fundamental principles of, he said, the most civilized thing we can do is to provide healthcare to people regardless of ability to pay. Why should healthcare be available only to those who have ability to pay? And a voucher system is not so bad, but it's not as bad as simple out-of-pocket health expenditure. I mean, I was looking at Sri Lanka recently, and half the healthcare in Sri Lanka is out of pocket. Half. It's not a rich country, and half is out of pocket. And the pockets are not very deep. So it means that you're depriving half the population virtually or half the healthcare use is less available to people. And that's not solved by a voucher system. One has to move to having universal health coverage.
You you say something about this, but I don't know if you want to add about what strategies we can use to address to fight poor governance in poor middle income countries like some Latin America. What can you add to that?
Well, I'm a bit out of my depth here, but I would say look at Costa Rica. I really struck by Costa Rica, and I've made a small number of visits there. Perhaps I don't understand it well enough, but what we need are properly functioning democracies. And I'm speaking coming from a high-income countries that's got, at the moment, a very poorly functioning democracy. My own country, the democracy is not functioning very well at the moment. I mean, I can't give advice when in my country, 2016, the UK voted for Brexit. Since 2016, in 7 years, we've had 5 prime ministers, 7 ministers of finance, 6 ministers of health. Wow. That's no way to run a railway. That's no way to run a country. That's not a properly functioning democracy. So it's difficult for me to, coming from the UK, which is pretty dysfunctional at the moment in terms of its democracy, to tell other people in other countries how to get a properly functioning democracy. But what we want is an educated population. And I think the action has to start locally. And my own view, for what it's worth, thinking about the UK, is the more cities, localities, regions we get active on the health equity agenda, the greater the likelihood of convincing the next national government to make a difference. And I don't know enough about how it works in Peru, but on one of my visits, I was quite impressed that there was real interest in Lima. There was real interest in regions of Peru of taking action. And that should happen as a way of influencing the national government.
Yeah, but this situation is even worse in Latin America nowadays. In Peru, even though we have a presidential system, which is different from the parliamentary system that we have in Europe, we had 6 presidents in 7 years. 6.
So you're
10 ministers since the beginning of the pandemic. 10 ministers, almost 1 every 3 or 4 months. So we have a high instability in the country. And in the region, we have different situations that are similar. Where can we start with?
Well, that's why I think action at the city level is encouraging. I met Michelle Bachelet at a meeting in Brazil just before the pandemic. And I talked to her about action in Chile. And she said, she had been president of Chile. And she said, well, at the moment, I can't recommend it because the current government's not interested. And Brazil was very interested. And then under Bolsonaro, national level, that interest evaporated completely. There's real interest again now. President Lula has got difficulties because he doesn't control the Congress. And so it's not straightforward. But at least having somebody who sets a different tone for the country makes a difference. But in Brazil, when Bolsonaro was president, action had to be at a different level. It had to be at the state or the city level. So I think that is one way forward.
Thank you. Do you still have some time for us? How many minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. There is another question about the culture and ethnic groups. The original groups, we have different cultures in different countries, and within the countries we have several cultural knowledge and that is transmitted generation by generation. How the perception of health of these different ways of think about about life can have an impact on determinants of health? What is the role of cultural thinking on ideas, perceptions of health that are different in different cultures?
Well, let me perhaps answer a slightly different question, because, well, in relation to the question as it was asked, well, of course, cultural differences can make a difference. Beliefs about diet, about practices, about psychological beliefs can make a huge difference. And I don't want to go into that. When I say, let me answer a slightly different question, one of the challenges, and we thought about this in our PAHO Commission, in thinking about indigenous people, the fact that all through the Americas, indigenous people were disadvantaged on social determinants of health and on health compared with non-indigenous. And I showed you one slide in the lecture I just gave. And the big challenge was how to create the right social and economic conditions while at the same time creating the conditions for different cultural groups to flourish in the way that is valuable to them. And that's a big challenge. So, for example, we talked about relationship to the land. In Canada, for First Nation Canadians, relationship to the land is vitally important. And I'm sure that's true for Indigenous people in other Latin American countries. Relationship to the land is very important. Mm-hmm. So, yes, our recommendations about early childhood and poverty and education are all very important. But how do you create the conditions for people to thrive within their cultural tradition? It can't be the case that our solution says, give up your culture and become a teacher or a nurse or a plumber or a carpenter. Give up your culture and become part of the mainstream society. That can't be the solution. The big challenge is how, as I'll say it a third time, how to create the conditions for cultural continuity, for flourishing within the cultural tradition without being disadvantaged with respect to the social determinants of health. And that's a huge challenge, but it's a vitally important one.
Thank you. Dr. Marmot, thank you for mentioning community engagement. This touches a key problem in Peru of a public health care system that is focused on delivery of healthcare services, avoiding work with communities outside the walls of a health facility. Where can one start to change health personnel attitudes towards community?
Well, again, let me talk about what we're doing in the UK. We've been working with, I started the lecture by saying healthcare is very important, but why treat people and send them back to the conditions that made them sick? We need action on the social determinants of health. But there's a lot of money spent on healthcare. So we've been working with integrated care systems, health and social care, to try to get them to address the social determinants of health with, I like to think, some success. In other words, for example, working with the mental health service, they're dealing with the problems of homelessness. They don't say, we'll just treat people's mental illness and forget about the fact that they're homeless. They're trying to deal with homelessness. They're trying to deal with problems of drug abuse and alcohol abuse. So we're trying to get the health and care system to address social determinants of health. I don't think it should be limited to them. As I've been saying all the way through, I think we need all the relevant government departments, the voluntary and community sector, businesses and the like, but also let's get the health and care system thinking along these lines as well.
Can you tell us a little bit more about school violence worldwide? How it has changed during the last times, and how it impacts also in inequity, and how it is related to inequity?
Yeah, I mean, the question of how it's changed over time, I don't have good data on that. And as I said, when I showed you the slide on femicide, that one of the problems is getting good data. I mean, when we went to Costa Rica the last time, and they look like they've got a big problem of violence against women, I don't think they have got a big problem, but they have good data. So they collect the data and it looks like they have a problem, not because their problem's bigger than other countries, but because other countries don't collect the data to the same extent. So it's hard to say with confidence what's happened over time. What we do know is that in general, inequalities, poverty are very bad for violence. Where I have seen these data, the greater the deprivation, the greater the levels of domestic violence, including violence against children, as well as violence against partners. And what we also know, if you look at adverse childhood experiences, the greater the frequency, and adverse childhood experiences, parental separation, parental mental illness, incarceration of parents, violence from parents, and so on. Those are all more frequent in more deprived areas. And people, this is data from Britain, people who experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences are far more likely to be perpetrators of violence and victims of violence. Half the perpetrators of domestic violence had experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. So the causal framework is reduced poverty and deprivation. That will lead to fewer adverse childhood experiences and diminished likelihood of those children growing up to be violent themselves.
Okay. We have some more questions, but I don't know if you still have time. If not, I will ask you the last question.
Yeah, let's make this the last one.
Yeah, it is more than a question. Some of the participants are asking what would be your message for the young public health practitioners, like the ones that are now studying in Master of Public Health programs in Peru and Latin America. What would be your message for these people, for this young generation, new generation?
I would say, and I have my tongue in my cheek a little bit, but I would say, make Peru a marmot country. Make your city a marmot city. And I mean, what I've done, and it doesn't necessarily mean that young people should do what I've done, but my approach has been that I find a door and I push on it. If it doesn't open, I don't bang my head against the door. I find one that will open. And I guess if I were more of a revolutionary and I pushed on the door and it didn't open, I would say, come on, we need to get organized and get a battering ram and knock down the door. But I'm not a revolutionary. So I mentioned that if you're trying to work with the national government and they're not interested, work with city or regional government that does want to get active. Don't get frustrated. Work with the people who want to work with you. So, I don't give advice to young people in case they take my advice, and that would be very dangerous. But what I would say is recognize that every journey has a first step. The more of us who are committed to health equity, to social justice and health, and find ways to work with communities, to work with villages, cities, regions, and if possible, whole countries, the more we'll make a difference. Make Peru a marmot country, and it'll be my pleasure to come back and visit you.
You are very welcome to come back again. We will try to get you back again. And thank you very much for your presentation and for your time. We know that you are having some rest, and we appreciate so much this lecture you have given us. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Good night.